Blood Emperor. I never believed in curses, in legends, or in things that go bump in the night. I was a skeptic, grounded in reality. But that was before I spent a night in the ancient ruins of a forgotten temple deep within the jungle. The story begins with a trip I took with a group of archaeologists. We were hunting for a lost civilization, one that, according to rumors, worshipped something darker than any of us had imagined. We had been tracking clues for months, piecing together fragments of ancient texts, and finally we had found it, the Temple of the Blood Emperor. It wasn't easy getting to it. The jungle was thick with mist, and the path was barely a trace, swallowed by the overgrown foliage. We had to hack through vines and wade through swampy patches, and every step forward felt like we were being drawn deeper into something we shouldn't disturb. But I had no choice. I wanted to be part of this discovery. I wanted to make my mark on history. As we approached the ruins, a sense of dread washed over me. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath, warning us to turn back. The stone walls of the temple rose like giants, their once pristine carvings now weathered and eroded, their edges sharp and unnatural. When we crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. It was sudden and unsettling, and I couldn't help but shiver. The others didn't seem to notice, or at least they didn't show it. They were too focused on their work, brushing away centuries of dust and revealing faded murals that spoke of a powerful ruler. A king, a god, a monster. The Blood Emperor. The name came to me like a whisper in the back of my mind, and as I looked at the faded portraits of a man adorned in regal attire, his eyes seemed to burn into my soul. His gaze was cold, unfeeling, yet there was something undeniably magnetic about it. The others were oblivious to the unnerving sensation. They chalked it up to the legend of the temple, of a ruler who had gained eternal life through forbidden rituals. I wasn't so sure. I wandered through the temple, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the atmosphere felt heavy. The air was thick, as though something was watching us from the shadows. I tried to brush off the feeling, but the further I ventured into the temple, the stronger the sensation became. There was a door, hidden behind a crumbling wall of stone. My heart skipped a beat when I found it. It was so out of place, perfectly intact, unlike the rest of the ruin. And it was locked. My curiosity got the better of me, and I took out my tools, working quickly to pry the door open. The moment it creaked open, a foul smell rushed out. Decay, rot, death. And then I saw it. A throne, but not just any throne. It was made of bone, human bone. Skulls formed the backrest, and the arms were shaped from twisted, gnarled limbs. But it wasn't just the throne that disturbed me. It was the blood-red marks that stained the floor, leading from the throne to the altar at the far end of the room. The altar was covered in strange symbols, and in the center, there was a pedestal holding a chalice. Before I could take another step, a voice echoed in my mind, a voice that wasn't mine. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. It wasn't a sound I could hear with my ears. It was inside my skull, reverberating, a voice that felt ancient and powerful. I turned back, looking for the others, but they were already out of sight. I was alone. A wave of panic hit me as I tried to backtrack, but my legs felt heavy, unwilling to move. It is too late now. The Blood Emperor sees you. I stumbled back into the chamber, my breath shallow, the world spinning around me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe, like living things. And then I heard it, a low growl, echoing through the stone walls. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. I blinked and then it appeared, a figure standing in the doorway, draped in tattered robes, their skin a pale, sickly white. Their face was obscured, hidden beneath a mask of blood. Their hands, oh God, their hands were clawed, with fingers that seemed too long to belong to any human. And it was then I realized the Blood Emperor was real. He was not a god or a legend. He was flesh, and he had been waiting for centuries. I ran. My body moved on pure instinct, my heart pounding in my chest as I bolted through the dark, narrow hallways. I could feel him behind me, his presence a suffocating weight, drawing closer with every step. I heard the whisper again. "You cannot escape." You belong to me now." I didn't dare look back, but I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the temple's silence. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the temple itself was closing in on me, pressing me toward my doom. I reached the exit, the bright light of the outside world just within reach. But before I could escape, a force slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. I gasped for air, struggling to rise, but something was holding me down. It wasn't a hand, but something far worse, a presence that clung to my very soul. And then I saw it, a vision of the Blood Emperor standing above me, his hollow eyes staring down at me with malice. His mouth opened, and a stream of blood poured from it, spilling onto the ground, spreading like a river of death. "You will stay here forever." I screamed, but the blood flooded my mouth, choking me, drowning me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I had died. But I hadn't. I woke up hours later, lying on the cold stone floor of the temple, drenched in sweat, my body aching. The temple was silent now, no sign of the emperor or his twisted presence. I staggered to my feet, my heart still racing, and I ran, straight out of that cursed place. But even as I escaped the temple, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, that he was still waiting. I thought I had left the Blood Emperor behind, but the nightmares, the nightmares, they never stopped. I see his eyes in the dark, feel his claws dragging across my skin, and I know one thing for sure, he isn't finished with me. It started with a story, one that I thought was just a tale, a myth passed down through generations. But it quickly became my nightmare. I should have never searched for the truth. But I was naive, desperate to uncover the secrets of my family's past. And now I'm paying the price. It all began when I found the journal. I had been going through the attic, cleaning out old boxes of things I thought had long been forgotten. Among the piles of old photographs, letters, and trinkets, there was a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was faded and worn, the pages yellowed with age. The title was nearly illegible, but I could make out the words "The Blood Emperor." My heart skipped a beat. I had heard rumors of this emperor, whispers about a tyrant from a forgotten kingdom who had ruled with an iron fist, whose name was said to curse all who spoke it aloud. Couldn't resist. I opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols, words I didn't understand, and passages that seemed to speak directly to me, as if the book had been waiting for me to read it. I had heard of the Blood Emperor before, but the truth behind him was far darker than I ever could have imagined. The Blood Emperor, according to the book, had ruled a kingdom centuries ago. He was a ruler whose thirst for power was unmatched, a man whose very existence was tied to blood, literally. He had forged a pact with an ancient, malevolent force, granting him eternal life. But there was a cost. The pact demanded that he sacrifice his own bloodline, ensuring that no descendant would ever escape the curse he had placed upon them. His blood was poison, and any who drank it or bore it would be doomed to repeat his reign of terror, forever bound to the blood of the emperor. The journal spoke of one last descendant of the emperor, a man named Lucas Vlahos, who still lived in seclusion, hidden away from the world. His name had been erased from history, but there was one family, mine, who had kept the secret. The bloodline still existed, but the curse had never been broken. I didn't believe it at first. It seemed too fantastical, too absurd. But the deeper I dug into the book, the more I found. There were mentions of strange deaths, disappearances, and even rituals tied to the emperor's blood. And the further I read, the more I realized that the Vlahos family had been involved in some of the darkest events in history. I couldn't stop myself. I had to find Lucas Vlahos. I had to know the truth. So I set off, tracking down the last known residence of the Vlahos family, a crumbling mansion hidden deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. When I arrived, the mansion looked like something out of a nightmare. The windows were boarded up, the front door hanging loosely on its hinges, and the surrounding grounds were overgrown with vines and weeds. The air around it felt oppressive, as though something was watching me. Something ancient, something powerful. I hesitated at the doorstep but then knocked. A long moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing an old woman with piercing, cold eyes. "You've come for him, haven't you?" she asked, her voice like gravel. She knew exactly why I was there. I nodded, my throat tight. "I need to speak to Lucas Vlahos. I need to understand." She stared at me for what felt like an eternity before stepping aside, allowing me to enter. The house was dark, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. The air was thick with the sense that time had stopped within these walls. She led me down a narrow hallway and into a room where an elderly man sat in a chair near a fire. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. "Lucas Vlahos, you've come too far," Lucas rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no turning back now." I froze in place, my body unwilling to move. His eyes seemed to bore into me, as though he were looking into my very soul. "I know what you seek," he continued. "The truth, the curse that runs through my veins. The blood of the Emperor." I swallowed hard. "Please, tell me everything." He sighed heavily, a sound filled with centuries of regret and pain. "The Emperor was my ancestor. He ruled with a thirst that could never be quenched, a hunger that tore his kingdom apart. He made a pact, gave his soul to an ancient force in exchange for eternal life. But that life was cursed. His blood, once spilled, became poison. It turned all who carried it into monsters, driven by the same hunger he had. Every descendant of the Emperor, cursed to never escape his thirst." I felt the room grow colder, the air thicker. I wanted to leave, to run far away from this nightmare, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot. Lucas continued, his voice shaking with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "The curse is real, and it's in me. It's in my blood. I tried to escape it, tried to live a life free from the Emperor's shadow, but it's never enough. The hunger comes for you, and you can never stop it." My heart raced. "But you're the last of the bloodline. You can stop it, can't you?" Lucas smiled bitterly. "You don't understand. The curse doesn't end with me. It ends with you." Before I could process his words, a sudden crash echoed from the hallway. The door to the room slammed shut, and I turned to find Lucas standing, his posture rigid and unnatural. His eyes were now glowing with an eerie red light, his hands trembling as though something within him was fighting to break free. "No!" he cried, clutching his head. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have touched the blood. It's too late. It's in you now." My pulse thundered in my ears as I took a step back. The air around me was electric, charged with an unnatural force. And then I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation running through my veins, as though my very blood was being tainted by something ancient and malevolent. I stumbled toward the door, but it wouldn't open. I heard Lucas's voice again, now a growl. "The Emperor's blood. You carry it now. It's in your veins, and it will never let you go." The walls of the room seemed to close in on me. I could hear whispers, voices from the past, calling to me, beckoning me. The hunger was growing inside me, clawing at my insides, urging me to embrace it. I turned back to Lucas, but he was no longer the man I had seen earlier. His face had twisted into something monstrous, his skin pale and stretched, his eyes red with bloodlust. "You can't escape it," he hissed. "The blood always calls." I fought to control my breath, my thoughts clouded by the pull of the curse. I could feel the hunger, the bloodlust rising within me. I knew I was about to lose control. I had to get out, but I couldn't. The blood was calling, and the Emperor was never truly gone. In that moment, I realized that I had made a terrible mistake. I had come looking for the truth, but I had found something far worse. The curse of the Blood Emperor was real, and now it was in me. The hunger would never stop, and I would never escape. The blood would always call. I never intended to stumble into the dark history of the Blood Emperor. The search for a lost legend was supposed to be just another quiet, academic pursuit for me. I didn't realize then that it would become my obsession and my nightmare. It all began when I found the journal, a dusty old book, bound in cracked leather, wedged between more mundane volumes in the library's forgotten archives. The name on the cover was too faded to read, but something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the way it seemed out of place, like an ancient relic tossed aside. Or perhaps it was the feeling I got when I touched it, like the book was waiting for me, waiting to be opened. Couldn't resist. As soon as I flipped open the first page, I felt a chill creep down my spine. The text was written in an elegant, flowing script, but it was the content that disturbed me. The words spoke of a tyrant king, known as the Blood Emperor, whose reign of terror and dark magic had scarred the land centuries ago. His name was uttered in whispers, even then, and the pages of the journal told a story far darker than I could have imagined. The Blood Emperor had ruled a vast empire with an iron fist, his power stemming from a pact he made with an ancient, malevolent force. In exchange for unimaginable power and eternal life, he agreed to sacrifice the souls of his people. But it wasn't just their souls that were taken. The emperor's thirst for power grew insatiable, and he began to consume the blood of his subjects, his need for blood becoming a driving force in his rule. His dynasty was built on bloodshed, and it was said that whoever tried to usurp him would be cursed with a thirst they could never satisfy, a thirst that would drive them to madness. The journal contained accounts of the emperor's death, or what I thought was his death. But as the pages turned, I realized that his reign never truly ended. The emperor had sealed his soul away, hidden in the blood of his descendants, ensuring that no one could ever truly escape his grip. And here's the terrifying part. His descendants still walked the earth, their bloodlines tainted, haunted by his curse. The Blood Emperor was still alive. I knew I had to find out more. Something in me wanted to understand this cursed history, to unravel the truth. The journal led me to a name, the Vlahos family. According to the records, the last known heir to the Blood Emperor's throne was a man named Lucas Vlahos, a member of an old, reclusive family that lived in a mansion hidden in the hills of a small, forgotten town. The Vlahos family had been rumored to have a dark secret. I decided to visit. The town was as isolated as it sounded. The streets were narrow and winding, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. I found the Vlahos mansion perched atop a hill, its stone walls weathered and crumbling. A feeling of dread settled over me as I approached the gates. The air was heavy, like something ancient and sinister was watching. But I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. A woman opened the door when I rang the bell. She was old, her face lined with age, but her eyes were sharp, too sharp. She seemed to know exactly why I had come. "You're looking for Lucas, aren't you?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as though saying his name aloud was a danger in itself. I nodded, trying to steady my nerves. "Yes, I'm..." She cut me off with a wave of her hand. "You shouldn't be here. No one should be looking for him. You don't understand what you're asking for." Her words hung in the air, but I couldn't turn back now. "I have to know," I said, voice trembling despite myself. "I need to know the truth about the Blood Emperor." Her gaze softened, almost pitying. "Then you will learn what I know," she said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. "But be warned, there's no turning back once you've crossed this threshold." The mansion was dark, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. We walked through the long, dimly lit halls, past portraits that seemed to watch us, their eyes following my every move. The woman led me to a room at the end of the corridor, where a fire flickered weakly in the hearth. Lucas Vlahos sat in a chair near the fire. He looked every bit the part of a man haunted by his lineage, pale, gaunt, his eyes dark and sunken. When he looked up at me, I could feel the weight of centuries in his gaze. "You've come to ask about the Blood Emperor," Lucas said, his voice rasping, like it hadn't been used in years. "I wish I could tell you it's a myth, a story invented to frighten children, but that would be a lie." He stood up, moving slowly as though each step cost him something. "I am his descendant, the last of his bloodline," he said with a grimace. "And the curse? It's real." I felt a chill as he spoke, an overwhelming sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. "The Emperor's blood flows through me, Lucas continued. But it doesn't just give me power, it demands sacrifice. It demands blood. He stepped toward me, and I could feel something shifting in the room. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen around him. I tried to escape it, Lucas said, his eyes flickering with madness. But it's always there, in the back of my mind, clawing at me. The thirst, it never goes away. And now it's calling to you. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind me. The woman was gone, and I was trapped in the room with Lucas. The temperature dropped even further, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, the instinct to run rising within me. "Don't resist," Lucas whispered, his voice low and insistent. "It's too late for both of us now. The Emperor's blood. It demands a price." His eyes were glowing now, a deep, unnerving red. He reached out for me, his hand shaking as though fighting an inner battle. I could see the hunger in his gaze, an ancient, unquenchable thirst that no amount of resistance could stop. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. "What do you want from me?" I asked, fear choking my words. "You already know," Lucas said, his voice trembling with the weight of centuries. "The curse is bound to blood, and yours is the last piece, the final sacrifice." In an instant, the room seemed to close in around me. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with an oppressive force. I felt the blood in my veins burn as though it were alive, as though the Emperor's curse was awakening within me. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, taking form, and I knew that if I didn't get out now, I would never escape. With every ounce of strength I had, I turned and ran. The house seemed to stretch on forever, the corridors shifting and twisting like a maze. I heard Lucas behind me, his footsteps echoing, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't know how I made it out, but when I finally burst through the door and into the night, I could still feel the weight of his presence, the curse following me, just out of reach. I've tried to forget, to leave the town behind, but the blood calls to me now, a constant, gnawing hunger that I can't escape. The Blood Emperor is still out there, his legacy alive in the bloodlines of his descendants. And somehow I know I'm a part of that curse now. I will never escape, and neither will you. I had always been intrigued by history, especially the dark corners of it. The forgotten kings and queens, the lost battles, and the curses that seemed to follow entire bloodlines. But nothing could have prepared me for the discovery I made when I stumbled across the legend of the Blood Emperor. It all began on an unusually hot autumn afternoon. I had just moved into a new apartment in a city that felt strangely familiar but foreign at the same time. As an aspiring historian, I quickly found solace in old libraries and archives. That's where I first found the tattered, leather-bound book. It sat on the highest shelf of a dusty, neglected section of the local library. The title was barely legible, a faded crimson ink that almost looked like blood. The Blood Emperor, Chronicles of the Forgotten Dynasty. My curiosity overtook me, and I took the book to the quietest corner of the library. The more I flipped through the pages, the more I became hooked. The story was set in an ancient kingdom, ruled by a tyrant known only as the Blood Emperor. According to the legend, he wasn't a mere mortal, but a being with a strange thirst for power and immortality. The Emperor's reign was drenched in blood, with an army of loyal soldiers who had sacrificed everything to protect his secret. The secret, however, was terrifying. It was believed that the Emperor had made a pact with dark forces, and in return for his soul, he was granted eternal life, bound to the bloodline of his heirs. His descendants, however, were cursed. Those who tried to claim the throne would be consumed by the thirst for blood, until they became mindless killers, driven by the same hunger that had turned the Emperor into a monster. The book spoke of a ritual that was said to end the bloodline, one that could break the curse, but it came with a warning. Those who attempted the ritual would never return. It was a story like no other. Felt too real, too sinister. But it was just a myth, right? I told myself it was just an old folktale until that night. I couldn't get the book out of my mind. I became obsessed, reading it late into the night, until I discovered something even more chilling. The Blood Emperor's story wasn't just a story. It was a warning. The curse hadn't ended, and the Emperor's bloodline still existed. I needed to know more. I tracked down the descendants of the Blood Emperor, each generation seemingly trying to escape the monster within them. Some had gone into hiding. Others had vanished without a trace. But there was one name that stood out: Lucas Vlahos. The Vlahos family, according to my research, was the last known living relative of the Emperor. They had lived in a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city for decades, their bloodline kept hidden from the world. The mansion was everything I had imagined, a Gothic nightmare. It was perched atop a hill, surrounded by twisted trees and overgrown ivy. As I stood in front of it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the weight of the air heavy with something I couldn't quite name. But I pressed forward. I rang the bell, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stood there, her eyes clouded with suspicion but a strange glint of recognition. "You're looking for Lucas, aren't you?" she asked, her voice thin and raspy. I nodded, surprised that she knew. "He's not the man you think he is," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure no one was listening. "But you've come too far now. You've uncovered the truth." The old woman led me through the mansion's long, dark halls, her footsteps echoing as though they belonged to someone much younger. She told me that the family had tried to escape the curse for generations, but the Blood Emperor's spirit was too strong. Lucas, her grandson, had inherited the same violent tendencies. He had tried to resist, to live a normal life, but the hunger was always there, gnawing at him. Finally, she stopped before a large wooden door, its surface carved with ancient symbols. "You must leave now," she said. "It's too late for him. It's too late for all of us." But I couldn't. I had to see it for myself. My obsession had already consumed me. I pushed past the woman and opened the door. Inside was a sight I wasn't prepared for. Lucas Vlahos sat at the center of the room, his back straight and his face pale as death. His eyes, no longer human, glowed with an unnatural red hue. His skin was stretched tight across his bones, and his lips were stained with dark crimson, as if he had just fed. "Do you see it?" he rasped, his voice filled with a chilling, almost manic undertone. "The blood never leaves. The hunger is eternal." Before I could react, the room seemed to close in around me. The air turned thick and suffocating, as though the very walls themselves were pulsing with life, with blood. I felt something warm trickle down my neck and realized, too late, that it was not sweat, but blood. I stumbled backward, but Lucas was faster. He was on me in an instant, his cold hand gripping my wrist, dragging me toward him. "No, you can't escape," he screamed. "The curse has already marked you." In that moment, I understood what he meant. The bloodline, the curse, it wasn't just about the Emperor or his heirs. It was about me. It had always been about me. The room seemed to spin as I tried to break free, but I could feel the blood calling me, drawing me closer to the abyss. It wasn't Lucas who had cursed me. It was the Blood Emperor himself, his spirit reaching across generations, across time, to ensure that the bloodline would never end. I don't know how I managed to escape that night, but I did. I ran from the mansion, my heart pounding in my chest. As I made my way down the hill, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate, relentless. And I knew, without a doubt, that the curse had followed me. Days have passed, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every reflection, every shadow, seems to hide something just out of sight. Sometimes, I wake in the middle of the night to the sound of something scraping against my door. Something that sounds like claws, or worse, teeth. The thirst is there now. It gnaws at me, just as it had gnawed at Lucas, just as it had gnawed at the Blood Emperor. I see red when I close my eyes. I feel my pulse quicken at the mere thought of blood. I don't know if I'll survive this, but if you're reading this, if you're out there, heed the warning. The Blood Emperor's curse is real, and it will find you, just as it found me. And once it does, you will never escape.